the panel's been asked to review the question for debate, really, that lot-by-lot purchasing is cheaper for the operator because it generates more competition than a turnkey solution. We have 25 minutes to debate and finalise an issue which, to my certain knowledge, has occupied half an industry of consultants and various other people in opining great thoughts on the choice between turnkey and lot-by-lot purchasing. But with the panel's agreement, I'll ask each of them to express their view on the basis of their experience so far, and in particular whether there are any areas which to them seem particularly appropriate or circumstances for lot-by-lot or more appropriate for a turnkey solution. Terry, would you like to start?
Well, I think you've already seen from Sarah some examples where you have to use some pragmatic approaches, really, which was that on a project like Crossrail and certainly with London Underground, we were both buying the same product for an identical use with the same sort of passengers with different specifications. And that just doesn't make sense. And so trying to challenge the way things have been done historically, where we're both trying to buy in an economic way on things like lifts and escalators, it seems to be entirely the right thing to do to try and agree on a modern specification and then to actually go out on a lot-by-lot basis. So I think we've already demonstrated, and there's more in the pipeline that we can do. Where it becomes much more complicated is around construction programs. We've done a little bit of specifying the sort of equipment we want to see fitted at stations, but generally you have to be very careful as a project just how much risk that's transferring into the client, where you really want the project managers to be managing their program, including the logistics of materials and delivery. So our focus is actually on where we've actually gone out with our big contracts on construction, is that we've introduced a new part of the process where we've been letting a lot of very large contracts together subject to competition. And we've actually finalised the choice about who we want to see win contracts. Of course, what you're frequently finding is that bidders have got quite novel, innovative ideas that they think add something that gives them a competitive advantage. Because of the multi-use of contracts that we've let, we've actually invited winning bidders to sit around the table together and to share their good ideas. And in spite of having a very competitive environment, we've found another 5 to 6% benefit in procurement savings as a consequence of getting our bidders who've won to share good practice. So I think there are different models that you just have to apply depending on the type of product you're trying to buy.
Could I just ask, Terry, in that situation you described just now, the bidders were willing and content to go through that process, or is there a degree of arm twisting involved? Or?
No, you have to incentivize. So the name of the game was that basically it's a 50-50 split.
Okay.
If there's a 6% benefit, the client gets 3, bidder gets 3.
So you were creating an incentivized win-win situation.
I think you have to.
That's very interesting. Stefan? Thank you, Jerry.
Yes, a turnkey approach for the Amsterdam program, which lasted 25 years, was not an option, especially because there was not a clear political decision before the program. It has been a development. But at the same time, we feel that you should not you should not make the lots too small. So we don't believe in competition by reducing the size of the contracts. So we try to find an optimum between the various parts in the program, but then still have significant or good size of the contracts. So we don't think you should compete with small lots, because the risks of not having a good integrated system is quite high then, I think.
And this you're seeing as being fundamentally about risk, and who is bearing risk?
No, to be honest, this has not been a choice before we started the program. It has more or less been a development. But we feel you should not reduce the lots or make them so small that perhaps you get a lower price per lot, but you increase the management risk significantly, and that risk will be paid in the final run.
Okay. Sarah, do you wish to add?
I think that things go in cycles, and certainly on the underground, having let quite a lot of PPP and PFI contracts, there seems to be a desire now to get further down and get more flexibility by letting smaller packages. I think the interaction with the operator on a live railway is very difficult, and operators are always going to want flexibility. And also, as soon as one thing goes out in a programme, you have to deal with the rest of the programme. So people seem now to be looking for getting to a level in the supply chain where they have a lot of flexibility to move things around and to deal with the operator interface. Have no doubt in 5 years' time we'll be back where we started.
It's swung back the other way. In the current situation, how are people, and if they're going for more and more packages, that implies, presumably it implies a greater degree of interface risk being borne by the client. Is that correct? And if so, how is it being evaluated?
Well, possibly not, because obviously they can be let under frameworks, so people have got rates, and therefore as the packages get developed, they get awarded a mini competition between people. Okay, they might have let a whole programme. On the other hand, the problem is if that programme changes and circumstances change. So, say for example, the Olympics, we've all known about it for a long time, but actually the operational restrictions weren't properly understood 4 or 5 years ago. And so now we're having to change those contracts to deal with circumstances that weren't known about. Whereas when we're lower down in the supply chain, we just flex the programme to deal with the circumstances as they face us.
So effectively it's being said that the situation is insufficiently fixed to allow turnkey contracts to be put into place.
Well, I think that is an issue with a complicated railway such as ours. So again, the fact that you can't have weekend closures on demand in the same way as was previously politically possible is a change that's happened over a very short period. When we let the PPP contracts, we didn't think about energy efficiency. That seems extraordinary today, but you know, within 8 years, that everyone was thinking that's a real problem. So you know, there's a balance between flexibility and long-term contracts, and how you try and ensure that you keep the optimal level of risk.
Steve, do you have a supplier perspective to contribute?
Yeah, it's good to have the opportunity to put a supplier's perspective on it. In answer to the question, lots or turnkey, I think it depends on a whole range of factors. One is your maturity as a buyer in terms of managing the technical interface risk. So if you buy a train and you want it to interface with the signalling system, etc., where are you on that spectrum? Some people just buy trains, some people buy turnkey solutions. The type of contract, if you're buying an output-based contract, so if somebody says, I want to buy so many diagrams of service, then it's up to the supplier to determine the number of trains, where the depots are, that type of thing. So I think it makes a difference. And again, it's back to the appetite of the buyer of where they are on that spectrum. So I think there's a wide range of factors which would make that decision for you, whether you want to buy in small lots or whether you want to buy in the turnkey. And I think there's many variants in between as well.
I think there's a huge number of variants in between, and I've certainly seen variations in behaviour by clients which tally roughly with what you're saying. There's a lot of suppliers and a lot of clients in the room. There must be opinions that people would like to voice on this matter? People wish to ask questions or make comments? Because at the moment we're reaching a point of saying that there's a range of options, that attitudes to risk are important, that attitudes of flexibility are important, and the questions, I think, of relative competence to achieve design optimization are important factors to be taken into account. Are there more factors that people would want to suggest as being relevant to this, to determining the choice of what's effectively a market strategy?
Perhaps funding as well.
Sorry?
I think perhaps funding,
Yes.
wherever the funding is coming from, I think that has an influence on what the procurement strategy is as well.
And presumably the cost of the funding as well. Please. Microphone's coming.
Murray Hughes from Railway Gazette International and Metro Report International. In a number of cases, we've seen an element of politicians deciding. In Amsterdam, there's obviously an element. I think with some of the Crossrail contracts, there's a political element, or likely to be. How do you deal with this? How do you factor this in?
Sorry? Microphone, no. and then Stefan.
Honestly, if you're serious about having open competition, you have to manage your stakeholders. And in that regard, there have been some changes made to how we want the bidders to comply with our requirements, but in no way does it compromise competition. The minute we start having directed procurement will be the day we lose competition for these contracts. Because why would you want to bid if you didn't think you had a fair chance of winning? And I think it's really important as the procurer of this equipment, whatever it is. And I have to say that you're right, there's one example that you can make reference to, but out of all the procurement decisions we've made to date, there's been no external influence whatsoever in making a recommendation. Indeed, our government's been quite determined that our board has a degree of independence that does not allow it to have its procurement decisions interfered with, because the minute you start doing that, the ownership of the project starts moving somewhere else, and it has to stay with those responsible.
Stefan?
My feeling is that the politicians in Amsterdam were very much concerned about the final product, the public transport quality, but they gave a lot of room for the way in which we would procure DBFM or DB, functional, technical, lots or turnkey. So we had relatively freedom in those strategic choices, as far as the politicians had the idea that we would have a good final product.
As well, since I've been in this role, I haven't encountered any political interference in procurement. I think because we're all bound by EU rules, etc., people are more concerned about going off rail rather than interfering with the decision, because that can be so dire for the project. So in my experience, people have kept well out of it, and in fact in the escalator procurement I talked about earlier, we didn't even tell the board who was who when we went up with the recommendation, and they didn't ask, so they still don't know.
Go on, Steve. You have relevant experience.
A little bit of relevant experience in this. I think you have to differentiate between the mood music in the political arena and what happens in the procurement. The procurement regulations 2006 and 2009 are very strict of how they can be applied. And I think if you're a responsible procurer, which all of the people here on the panel are, they will follow the rules that they publish. And there can be all the noise that's happening outside, but at the end of the day, they follow the procurement process.
And certainly my experience of RIA members is there aren't many that I would imagine wishing to bid in any other situation, for exactly the reason Terry says. Other points? Any other questions people wish to raise? I think we may also take any questions on the presentations that have been made already. If there are any points remaining from there, please. Microphone's coming to you.
Yes, a question for Crossrail. Nothing about procurement, but more technically, did you ever consider going for double-decker trains? I know it increases the tunnels a teeny-weeny bit, but it would give you enormous capacity on the trains.
The answer was that we were asked to look at it. Clearly, if you're building a new tunnel, having a tunnel that might be 10 metres diameter across the central London just makes it that much more complex. But to be frank with you, the issue is much more, it's only 20 kilometres of new track in the middle. If you are incapable of actually having a double-decker on the existing infrastructure, getting the rail trains to the tunnels, it becomes something of a academic exercise, to be frank. There's too many existing legacy issues that just prevented double-deckers. It was a interoperability consideration that we went through, but at the end of the day, we couldn't make the mechanics of the business case work about creating potential in the future. And we've had a number of these issues that talk about interoperability coming forward, and double-decker was one of them.
Thank you.
That's true. Any more? Any more? No? Very quiescent. Any further points the panel wishes to add? Otherwise, we'll close the session. No? Murray.
Yes, can I ask about the central part of Crossrail? You said very much it's metro-style operation. How much did you look at dwell times, numbers of doors, size of doors, that kind of thing? Because I get the impression from what you were showing up there, there's only 2 sets of doors per car per side, is that right? Or are there 3?
That's to be concluded once we start getting the tenders back. We've laid down a specification in terms of dwell time and the number of passengers that are being carried. We have our own ideas about what it should take, but we're asking the bidders to consider with their different models how they would actually do it. So that's not yet been determined. I thought you were going to ask that one of the other features, of course, it is a metro system. And one of our big challenges, it's not that different to the double-decker question, is on signalling. Which signalling system do we go for? Yeah. And I'm not going to be first putting a new railway signalling down in the underground. Jubilee line went through that. Scars are still very deep, so we are putting down MTBC in that central section and creating interoperability for the future. If and when ETRS becomes a feature that is robustly applied across the network, then clearly we have to have the capability of interfacing and using that technology at the right time. In an ideal world, we're quite happy to be second and third with that type of signalling, but we're not going to be first. It's too aggressive an environment down there.
Steve?
I think one more point worthy of note is the experience recently is that the industry tends to go out for consultation a long time before the procurement specifications are set in stone. And I think that's probably very valuable for the buyer as well as the supplier to actually be able to input or be able to correspond on the potential specifications that come out. So I think that's probably quite useful as well.
Irrespective of whether we're talking about lots or turnkey?
Yeah, sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sarah, were you wanting to? No. And one could make the same point about the whole collaborative agenda being pursued now by a number of major clients in the UK and in some places overseas, I know. If there are no further points to be raised, then there's one at the back, please. Just by the open door.
I was intrigued about the jobs aspect of the Crossrail project. Is in the States you were precluded from considering local hiring and procurements. Is that something that was required by your funding partner?
I don't know whether it's the right thing to say. I met a guy from New York Metro a month ago, was so envious of what we're doing. And it surprised me that the biggest restriction that expressed to me was not to do about whether it's the right thing to do, but trade unions wouldn't let you. There were customary practices and restricted practices that ensure that those who were appointed into roles actually came from a trade union rather than being best fit. I have to say the UK economy is it has a rightful role with trade unions, but right now it's really important that if we're going to see an infrastructure investment that is prioritised, it has to have more than just the infrastructure delivered. It has to have this legacy, and I think that's really important part of how you engage with the politicians. Whilst a new railway might be very exciting, politicians also, the trouble with a railway project like mine, it doesn't deliver till 2018, 2019 in terms of full service. Politicians always need things quicker than that. So being able to put forward the agenda around jobs and employment, again, is all about engaging with the politicians and those that you're trying to ensure continue to support you. It's a very, if I take the example of David Cameron, whilst he might get very excited about a project in 2018, taking him down to meet a young 22-year-old lady working on a project who's never had a job, for a politician, that's instant success. And that's the environment in which we operate. Long-term investment, but there are some short-term benefits.
Oh, I don't disagree with the policy objective that you're trying to achieve. The federal government just believes it's exclusionary and discriminatory and anti-competitive to have that type of requirement in the States.
Well, I've heard that argument often expressed actually in European procurement, and I've often heard people in the UK say you can't do it because of those very reasons. My experience is if you set that down as a goal for every bidder to comply with, it isn't anti-competitive. In fact, it's as far as I'm concerned, it's a level playing field.
Do you think, Terry, it's easier for you to achieve that because you're working within the London framework rather than a national framework?
No,
which
let's
I've
be
also
very frank about it. It's with Sarah coming from a very commercial and legal background, I can put these ambitions into a contract. I can get contractors to sign up for it. Getting them to comply is we're never going to take a contract off somebody who's performing in terms of time, cost, and delivery. But from my point of view, where I am, people made a commitment to me that they were going to do this. So for me, there's a passion you have to have about what you might describe as a soft subject, but it can be done and it can be made to work. But you don't have to do it to deliver your project. For me, it's a question of legacy. And the reason why I care about the legacy issue is it isn't just about this project, it's about how do you keep politicians engaged in the next one and the next one. And it has to have that broader agenda that has some degree of longevity around how does, for example, in the UK, how do we restructure the scale and size of this economy, which has been very dependent on financial services. It doesn't mean to say financial services, they are critically important to us, but we need a better mix in terms of how this economy is driven. That's why I think it's so important to the politicians that they have the full agenda of what they get when they invest in infrastructure.
I said you had been lifelong passionate for the skills agenda in particular. Sarah?
I was just going to add to that if you ask your lawyers, they'll always say you can't do it. But actually, if you do things that people don't regard as unfair, the likelihood is you do it. You tell people what you're asking for, and it's a level playing field. And actually, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So my advice is don't always stick entirely to what your lawyers say.
I think on that splendid note, I think we can bring these proceedings to an end.